to Elisabeth Hogarth's designs. I'm back with part 2 of my washi tape cards. You remember last week we made a selection of arty cards, vintage cards and floral cards, all using washi tape, and I really did appreciate the kind comments that you left me, so I am showing you another set of cards using primarily washi tape. So this is my collection, and this time I'm going to be delving into some bronzes, some of the map style papers, and I'm going to be making quite a few cards that feature die cut text. The first card is a play on a twisted ribbon design. I'm using scraps of card. The card base will be a 4x6, so this scrap of card is going to be round about 3 inches, and I measured it to about 5.5, but I changed my mind on the design and I'll show you why a little bit later. When you make these cards for yourself, it's a good idea to score along the 1/2 inch mark, but you can't really see that on camera, so for the purpose of this I'm going to show you how to mark it using pencil. But personally, if I was making them for myself, I would score them lightly so that you don't see any of the pencil marks. You can easily use this method and then just rub them away as I did. But all I'm doing here is measuring them at 1/2 inch increments, and you want a very faint horizontal line, and you're going to use these as your grid lines. I find a really inexpensive tea ruler really handy for tasks like this. You can buy them very cheaply on Amazon, but it makes sure that you've got straight lines and you don't have to do extra markings. So once we've got the lines in place, remember you can do these as scores, we're going to bring in the washi tape, and a good idea is to have one plain piece and then one pattern piece. So the plain design will be almost like the reverse of a piece of ribbon, and the pattern design is what you would see at the front. So we're putting the plain design in first. So I'm going from the first 1 inch line to the right hand 1 inch line. So you're going across the 1/2 inch marks. This will allow you to create neat and precise gaps in between the washi tape. So we're just moving down the card from the left down vertically to the right. We're then working on every other line, so this time it's the 1/2 inch to the 1.5 inch, and you're still using those grid lines. On this particular one you're going to see the pencil marks, so these do need to be rubbed away, and I found at this point that the washi tape had worn away. This is a very old tape, so I'm not surprised. It's at least 6 years old. So all I did here was I removed some of the tape that was still usable, and then I replaced it, because then in my mind I changed the design and I'm going to put a topper on the faded part. So all I needed to do was just make sure that it looked pristine on the parts that were visible. This is the advantage of using the washi tape, is that you can lift it up easily and then replace it as you need. So then I'm going to burnish them down. I had a question about whether washi tape peels away. If you find that you haven't got very sticky washi tape even after burnishing it, then I would recommend putting some double-sided tape down or some glue. So all I did then was rub away the pencil marks, And because of the way the washi tape worked out, I'm moving from a portrait card to a landscape. So I'm going to slightly cut down the design, but I didn't want to waste it completely. And that's quite often what happens when you're card making. You're adapting and reusing things. So that's how it would have looked if it was a portrait. But again, I'm going to cut it down and I'm going to turn it into a landscape panel. I then am going to bring in some mirror card to create a topper. But first I'm going to trim away the excess part of the folded ribbon design. And then that's going to be stuck in place with some wet glue, just as a side panel. And then, as I say, I'm going to bring in some mirror card and create a topper, and that will disguise that faded part that you can see in the middle of the picture. So I'm going to go ahead, get the mirror card, die cut out the topper, and I'm also going to be bringing in a stamp sentiment. The stamping block is here just to keep the mat flat while it's drying. So I'm bringing in a small piece of mirror card. I've got a scallop circle with an inner circle that I'm going to add the sentiment to. So I'm just trying out the sentiments that will fit within the circle. And then I'm going to use my VersaFine Black Clair ink to stamp the sentiment. I needed to prime it a little bit first, but this is the beauty of the stamping platform, that you can go in as many times as you need to get the result that you want. So now I can die cut them both out. I added a little bit of paper to the top of the sentiment because I didn't want the ink to fall onto the cutting mat. It's only because it was fresh ink. Normally if you leave it to dry there won't be any problem at all. So once they're die cut, I'm going to cut away the excess of the mat, and then I want to add some rounded corners, and then I'm going to bring in some foam tape to add to the topper. I'm going to add glue to the sentiment and foam tape to the bronze mat, just to add a little bit of interest to the depth of the card. You can see now how the twisted ribbon design shows up on the panel, and then this mirror card is a nice coordinating touch. So there's your sentiment, and then once it's dry I'll come in and add some sequins. Card number 2 is based on a card that I shared many years ago at a Craftwork Cards workshop, where we laid out strips of papers to create like a woven effect. So here I'm creating half-inch strips. They can be any length that you like, but the washi tape is round about 1/2 inch wide, and all I'm doing is adding some strength to the washi tape because I'm then going to make it into woven strips. I kept to the same colour palette, but I've picked a range of patterns and gingham and checked to try and make it quite a bold and intricate design. I added a little bit of floral as well, and so I ended up creating about 7 strips because I'm using a 7x7 inch card. So once these strips are in place, I have a little go at laying out the card to see how the papers will weave in and out of one another. So this is just a quick trial at how these are going to look by eye. Some of the washi tape needs to be folded over, but that's fairly easy to do. So all I'm doing is working out which way I want the woven strips to go. I'm looking at the patterns, I'm looking at the colourways. Try not to overthink it. It's meant to look half undone. The strips of card, even though they're the same width, will end up being different lengths because that's how it would look on a piece of unfinished work. So now I'm going to cut down the strips randomly, and then I'm going to cut in a fishtail. So when you're doing these, cut in the centre line and then cut from the two outside points and across. And I'm going to keep going until I've worked through all 7 pieces. All the time I'm eyeing the layout of the card. The strips are different lengths, but you're going to lay them, as you can see here, randomly, so the heights are different and the overall effect is meant to look like it's thrown together. So once you've got all of the pieces ready, you can start weaving. So I'm going to use my T ruler to help me line these up. So I'm going to take the first piece. Once I've cornered the sides of the card, I'm going to take the first piece and I'm going to add a small dab of glue to the top, and then I'm just using the T ruler to make sure that it's vertically square. And then I'm using the numbers as a guide to the width between the 2 strips. So I work all the way through, adding a small dab of glue only to the top, because we want to leave it open so that we can weave in the horizontal strips. So each time I'm using the T ruler to give me the correct distance between the strips, and then I turn and we're working on the horizontal, and again just a dab of glue, and then we're going to go back in. Once it's secured down a little, we're going to go back in and we're going to start weaving the horizontal through into the vertical. You'll probably find your own way of doing this, but I like to be able to see that the lines are straight, and then I can start the weaving process. You may prefer to do each strip as you go. So once I know the edges are secure, I'm just going to leave it to dry a little bit. I'm using tonic glue so it dries quite quickly. So now I'm going to go in and under, and then over and under. So, and then on the next one it's over and under. It's just the opposite of what you've done on the top strip. And again, under, over, and then you can bring in some extra glue. Try and leave the ends so that they're flexible, because then it makes it look more like a piece of ribbon. Sentiment to the vertical side, and I'm using an eraser just to take away some of the dried glue. So there's the sentiment, and then later on, once it's all dry, I'm going to add some further sequins. So now moving on to card number 3, and card number 3 actually gave me card number 4 as well. My original plan was to create some bright and bold letters using these Spellbinders dies, so I brought in a mix of colours and patterns. I think this is the one where I use the washi tape with the map on as well. So to begin with, all I wanted to do was to make a background in order to die cut in the H and the I for the high. So I used a scrap piece of paper, and then I'm lining up all the various patterns of the washi tape. I use different widths, different patterns, different colours. Then I put in the high, and it occurred to me that I could then use the background piece as well. So I cut out the high, and then I found a rectangle die, and I used that to cut out a border as well. So if you can imagine, we're going to end up with two highs, one with the inverse and one with the opposite. So I'm die cutting quite carefully so that I've got two cards for the price of one. I cut the letters first. I made sure that the patterns were working across the entire design, and then I came back in again with a rectangle die, and I tried to centre the wording, because then this is going to become the background of card number 4. So quite often this will happen, that I'm working with one design and I think, oh, I rather like the waist, so how can I incorporate that into a second card? So now I'm going to be working with two cards at once. I've got the 6x4, and I've die cut some more white letters to give some depth to the high. I also end up die cutting into black card, and then eventually I decided to use the front of the letters, which is like a stitch design that spellbinders have brought in so that you can do cross stitch as well. And then I incorporated the stitch design into the patterned paper just to add some extra interest. So this is card number 1, where the high is the front of the card, and then I've added a sentiment. And this is card number 2, where I added a black layer and the white detail inside the waist of the first card. It's then time to move on to card number 5, and this time I'm using a flag design, and I'm going to inset some Tim Holtz letters. So I'm eyeballing how much washi tape I need to put onto the card itself to begin with. I'm using a range of hearts and valentine washi tape here, so it's all shades of red and black. Sadly at this point I was struggling with my index finger because I'd got a really awkward paper cut, and it makes you realise just how much you use the index finger on your left hand. So I slowed down a little bit here, but all I'm trying to do is to build a strip of colours onto the background of the card itself before I die cut a plain white flag tag with an inbuilt sentiment. So there's the base of the card all ready to go, and then I want a scrap piece of white card. I'm using some Tim Holtz sentiments, which are really handy for cutting into the tag, and then I'm laying this onto the washi tape so that you can see all of the colours coming through. I also keep all of the insides of the letters, like the A and the R. It's a little bit tricky, but it's worth adding the inside parts because then it makes better sense of the letters. This is where the precision glue gun comes in handy, because you can add such small parts. So all I'm doing is adding glue to the centre of the O and the A, and then I'm taking away the main part of the letter, so that all I'm left with is the circle or the small semicircle for the other letters. So once they're all in place, I actually add another layer of the tag to hide all of my workings, and then this card is good to go. I'm rounding up the corners, and then later on I'll add another sentiment and some sequins. We're moving swiftly on to card number 6 now, and again I'm rounding off the corners before I decide to create a sort of shadow card with another large sentiment. So I cut this out several times. It says paper hugs, and then I laid out the die itself, and all I'm doing here is marking roughly where the bottom of the letters are. Then I'm bringing in some floral washi tape, and then I'm going to bring the die back in again, and I'm lining the bottom of the letters up with the strip of washi tape. It will take quite a long time for you to see the effect of this card, but to begin with I'm using the outside of the die to line up where I want the actual letters to look. It's rather like creating a shadow card, but in the end I don't use all of the inner parts of the letters. So I die cut with ordinary white card 2 or 3 times, and all I'm doing here is carefully lining up each one of the letters that I want to glue into place. The first layer is the trickiest, but if you keep the outside of the die cut, then you can glue all of the elements back into the spaces, and you'll be able to keep them straight and lined up rather than having to work out how to do the spacing yourself. I'm working carefully at this point because at this point of making the card I was thinking in my mind that I needed to keep all of the inner elements of the letters, because if you were making a true shadow card, those are the pieces that you would stick to the base of the letter, and then it gives the illusion with all of the extra layers that you've got a shadow beneath it. But because of the way that the card worked out with the washi tape and that these letters are fairly big, I ended up just keeping them with the spaces in between. So if you were making the version of this card, it probably wouldn't take this long or look nearly as fiddly, but I wanted you to see my thought process as I'm crafting at my desk. You can see by the variety of cards that the washi tape can be a really versatile tool, especially if you want to revamp some old card designs that you have tried before. You can make them clean and simple, or they can be far more floral as I showed you last week. It's a really versatile way of crafting and relatively cheap as well. So all I'm doing here is building up the layers of the letters, and then I will bring into play the set of letters where the washi tape is lying at the base of each letter. I'm now ready to add the washi tape letter, and you'll see the design come to life. I was really quite surprised at how effective this simple little technique ended up being. So you could imagine doing this with much bolder washi tape and some bright colours, or you could add colour to the card itself. But it's a really good technique to work with, And as I say, the bigger the letters, the bolder the effect. At this point I'm on layer number 3, and I decide to take out the smaller element within each one of the letters because I like the effect that I've got thus far. Once these are all in place, I'm going to bring in my stamping block again just to keep it flat while I'm drying off the letters. I decide to embellish this card with some dewdrop adhesive embellishments. I've got a suitable sentiment in place, and then I'm adding a triangle of the dewdrops just to add that sweet finishing touch. Then I move back to card number 1, and again I've added a sentiment, and I'm bringing in some copper coloured sequins to tie in with the bronze washi tape and topper. Then I move on to the woven strip card, and this is quite a bold card, so I'm bringing in some bright pinks and blues, and I'm adding the sequins to complement the colour within each part of the card. So where the washi tape is yellow and pink, I add those colour sequins, and where you can see it as blue, I tie it in with the blue. I'm sticking to the same colour palette for the 2 high cards. Again I've added sentiments from the Tim Holtz range, and I'm trying to keep the blues where they show on the card. This second card I think ends up being my favourite of the whole set because I really like the background, and I like that I've added black as an inlay to the high. You'll have to let me know in the comments below which one of the cards you like the most. And then I'm bringing in some shades of pink for this Love With All Your Heart card. If I was making this card again, I think I would change the colour of the tag, but it still ends up being a pretty little card. Here are the cards again. We began with the twisted ribbon technique, and I think this card turned out really well. Then we've got the woven strips, which is very bright and bold. We've got my favourite card here, which is the high, where we got the 2 cards out of one idea. I think these worked out really well. I'd make these ones again. I really like that die as well. We've got the Love With All Your Heart, and then we've got the Paper Hugs, which is much more subtle. So before I go, let me bring back in the other cards as well. So we've got the vintage one with the background. Then we've got the arty one where we use the patchwork washi and cut it down. And then we've got the floral cards where we made a background, and then we die cut all of these elements out before adhering them to the card. So as you can see, you can make an amazing array of cards with your collection of washi tape. I hope I have shown you some new ideas here, and please do pull out that washi tape and get crafting. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to welcoming you back to Elisabeth Hogarth Designs very soon. Take care, bye bye.